Welcome to Novelist Spotlight. This is where we talk to published authors. We learn about their best practices, the lessons that they've learned, their insights. We incorporate them into our own writing. At least that's the theory. In the spotlight today is Chip Jacobs. Chip goes back a long ways with me. We were in our 20s when we met. We were working at the Los Angeles Business Journal. We both harbored aspirations to be published authors. Chip is much farther down the line than I am, I'll tell you that. He's published several nonfiction books. He just recently published a novel that has done very well. It's called Arroyo. We'll be talking about that a little bit. And about all things writing with Chip Jacobs. Chip, welcome to the program.
Thank you, Michael Consol. It's great to be with you. And I think back to those heady young days for the internet when we considered a small Mac screen computer the vanguard of technology.
Yeah, that's about it. But I will tell you that the internet has made writing so much easier. I mean, the research is incredibly easier than it was back then. When we used to still get annual reports mailed to us, and we'd file them in filing cabinets. I mean, that's how archaic it was. We're really kind of turning our hand now on our age. But
I'll tell you what, though. When I look back at my college years, when we didn't have the internet, computers were first starting to come in. I liked going and physically getting a book. I like doing the Dewey Decimal System. There's something though that teaches you about hunting, about deduction, tenacity. Today it just seems so dang easy. And I think it's kind of like the problem getting a calculator, not really knowing how to do math. You just rely on a calculator. Well, you don't. You might be able to do the function, but you could never explain it. So, part of me is a little nostalgic for that era.
Well, you better be able to explain writing, because whether you're doing it on a legal pad or the old typewriter or on a word processor, it's really the same considerations pretty much. I mean, there's little nuances that come along with the technology and whether you're writing by hand or there's still lots of, well-known authors who write by hand. They just feel like that's the best work, comes right through the fingertips.
That's true. I have a buddy who writes all their stuff legal hand on a legal notebook pad. When I was in college, I had an IBM Selectric, and I was a journalism major, and I was doing, obviously a lot of writing, assignments, etc. And I would just get into a manic stage where I'm just hammering away on the keyboards, making corrections with whiteout, and then during the summers, I would take my typewriter, my IBM Selectric, to the typewriter repair guy in Pasadena, where I live, and he would be furious at me. Like I had, marred and scratched, a Beatles guitar. How I mistreated this typewriter. Didn't he understand what it was like to be a college kid? But he took such pride in this thing, and sometimes I would go in knowing I was going to get a lecture just to get my damn typewriter cleaned.
Now, you write on a word processor today, is that right?
I do.
Okay. What about the differences between the old, Underwood hammer the keys one by one versus a writing freehand on a legal pad or any kind of paper, or being on a word processor? Do you see a real difference there? I mean, would you ever write any other way than with a word processor?
No, I wouldn't. In fact, when I was a reporter, we make our trade with our brains, hopefully, a notepad, right? Reporter's notepad, and a pen. And sometimes it would not be always the easiest when I'd go to some chaotic news conference or some event, and I'd come back and stare at 20 pages of notes, on those slim notepads, and think of, what the hell did I write? I can't read that word. What did she say? And hoping I didn't get in any trouble. Today you notice, nobody has a notepad out. They're all just sticking their, iPhones into a politician's face or into the scene of the incident or whatever, and then they probably have some transcribing software, right? So it's I don't know. There's something about writing it out that really helps you. And When I was a journalist, I would come back and transcribe my notes the best I could, and it was really helpful. I re-educated myself, and it really kind of saw what the story was about just by doing that mental transferring of, chicken scratches to actually a Word file. So. Yeah,
Well,
it's strange how your brain works.
The method has been working for you because you've been very successful with the book publishing business, Chip. You've got, as I was saying, several different nonfiction books out. You just recently came out with Arroyo, which I read, and also got the audio edition as well. So I hit you twice on that one. Some extra royalties there, your direction, Chip. Where do you feel like you're at right now? You came out with Arroyo, it did well. What is next on the writing agenda for you? Are you working on something right now?
Yes. After Arroyo, I thought I would be jumping quickly into my follow-up novel, which I've started to conceive, and I can explain in a bit. But I was, as the epic perfectionist that I am, and some people would say that's just a bad case of literary OCD. I was never happy with a true crime book that I had written some years back. I kind of buried the lead of the story. It didn't fit the genre right. It was too much biography and not enough mystery. So I went and rewrote that whole thing. And during the pandemic, I just made it one of these boxes I had to check off. So that book is I think it's a pretty good, unusual true crime story called The Darkest Glare, a true story of murder, blackmail, and real estate greed in 1979 Los Angeles. So I got that out of the way. And then I also was dealing with Warner Brothers was nice enough to option one of the first books I'd written, which was a nonfiction book about the LA smog crisis. I got very involved in seeing how you take a literary project and try to convert it into a series. And so though I'm not working with that team anymore, where I'm working with a new team on Smogtown, so I got distracted a little bit, Michael, but I felt we are in the age of streaming, and I would be doing a disservice to all my work if I didn't just delay my next novel to focus on those things.
Well, so, you mentioned Hollywood, and just to be clear to everybody, Chip mentioned Pasadena. He didn't say where, though. It's not Pasadena, Texas. Pasadena, California, very close to Hollywood, where all the beautiful people live. And you've been in conversations, and I think submitted some treatments or such, Chip.
I have.
Now that's one of the big things that writers think in terms of, novelists think in terms of, I would love to see my book turned into a movie. Tell us what you know about that whole process. It's got to be incredibly difficult, even with your proximity.
I mean, I'll just say I'm so grateful that most of my writing career was a journalist, because there's not a lot of roadblocks and people between you trying to tell a piece of history on the fly and seeing it produced in a newspaper, in a few days. And it's in a way, it's more gratifying. You know that your effort is going to result in publication that potentially millions of people will see. When you work, as a book writer, it's somewhat the same, but, there are more people sort of involved. And the process begins, it gets about the commerce and the marketing, right? Now, when I went into working with people in Hollywood, though, I've had many people in my family work as directors, writers, composers. It is like speaking another language.
So you have an unfair advantage over the rest of us. It's in the it's in the family, it's in the blood.
Yes, but I'll tell you that
in some ways.
In some ways, but I tell you, I often think about what my grandfather told my mom and my uncle, which he said, just whatever you do, avoid this industry. It's, it can be very gratifying and exciting, but boy, it can also be disappointing and ruthless. And I feel like I felt all of those emotions. And the people the main people at Warner Brothers I worked with, I really liked them a lot. I learned a lot. I kept my mouth closed, and I try to understand how they took a piece of nonfiction and how they storyfied it, in a presentation to develop a pilot and the rest of the treatment. And it's not easy. It's all about the characters, in Hollywood. To me, that's what I've learned. And in books, of course, but the backdrop that I think so much about, I'm so interested in, more on the kind of sociological and public issues and collisions, those take a backseat. It's always got to be about characters, arc, interaction, and
family, of course.
Yeah. The people in Hollywood, there's one movie that they always come back to, and sometimes I don't think there's a clear relevance to what you're working on. The Godfather. I mean, The Godfather is like the Godfather of every movie idea, and. I felt like I felt like not an interloper or a dilettante, but I did feel like an outsider looking in to the Hollywood process. Of course, when I was working on this, the pandemic hit, and so we were doing all our meetings by Zoom, and you just lose a lot of camaraderie, collaboration. Most of your communication is nonverbal, and so. Like when I'd be in a newsroom working with people on a story, you just understood at a different level because you're in the same space. So it did make it more challenging being separated by people and clicking a link to do your teamwork. But sure. Like I said, I did like the people at Warner Brothers a lot. Did we always see eye to eye? Of course not. That's just the nature of creative collaboration.
Now, but wouldn't you say, Chip, that anybody writing a novel should not be thinking in cinematic terms? They shouldn't be writing it with the idea that it become a movie. Because I think you can see some novels out there where it's pretty clear this guy was thinking, I want this to be a movie, and it looks more like a screenplay than it does a novel.
Yes, there are people. I mean, I'm sort of learning. For somebody that likes to think that they're a quick learner, my mom used to say, "You're a quick learner, but you're a late bloomer." And it's a weird paradox.
But it's biblical. It's kind of biblical.
It is biblical, I guess. Maybe it's some stubborn quality.
Not to give you too much credit.
No, but I mean, I think it is true. If you think about, I'm going to write this to be a series, or I'm going to write this to be a $300 million movie. You're already investing too heavily on the outcome and not investing enough on the process. And so, with Arroyo, which I'll tell you about soon, how I worked on it, good and bad ways. But my next novel, I'm trying to block out the noise, be on the internet less. If I could just withdraw from social media, 100%, I would do it. You do have to focus because I listened to another one of your authors, the former Marine. He had some good points about getting up early, being disciplined, and writing every day. Investing in the process.
Do you write every day, Chip?
When I'm writing a book, I'm writing 5 days a week.
Okay, now Sidney Sheldon, who is not a giant of the industry in terms of literary criticism, he was never a favorite of the critics, but he sold millions of books and had movies made after his books. And the reason I'm bringing him up is because he used to say, along the lines of what you were saying, that when he goes to write, he isolates himself, completely immerses himself in the work, and he will not read anything else because he doesn't want to be influenced by anything else. So you're talking a little bit about kind of a submersive process.
I for sure am. I am, and I'm going to do things differently than Arroyo. I'm going to be much more focused on, like I said, I'm going to tune out the noise. I'm going to be very strategic about what books I read, because I'm going to read. My oldest daughter is a bibliophile, and she was reading like 70 books a year. I'll be lucky if I get through 25 or 30. And actually, it's for me, it's hard for me to really throw myself into a book or get absorbed by a story when I'm writing my own. It's like my brain has some, firewalls in it.
Well, there's also, don't you agree there's the danger that I'll tell you what happens to me. I suspect it might happen to you. When I'm reading somebody, then I go to write, oftentimes I feel like I've picked up their tone. Because I'm such
yes.
an empathetic guy, Chip. I'm so empathetic. I just pick that up from these other authors, and it truly, I'm kind of joking right now, but I truly find myself trying to strike their tone unconsciously. But then I'm seeing it on the page, and I realize what's happening.
Yes, I mean, and that's why your Marine also said, the real lift of writing, and they don't teach you this as a journalist. It's rewriting. Your job of your first novel is to produce a crappy version of what could become a gem, and it's up to you to create that transformation. And you do have to be very disciplined. I mean, we live in a world today where there's 300-400 whatever books released a day. Some of them are by massively talented, established authors, others by people that are just starting. But it's just like a big fire.
Most are crap. For instance, it's the consultant who's doing a PowerPoint presentation, expands his PowerPoint into a book, and then sells it in the back of the room for $25, and that's how he makes his real money on top of what they've paid him to show up. Then there's a lot of people who just couldn't make it through the traps and ended up self-publishing. Now, I raised my hand. I self-published my one and only novel I have out there, but I'm reserving 3 others for, something else perhaps. But we can easily get discouraged about all that stuff, Chip, but don't you think that good work still stands out because there's so many people out there who are truly dilettantes or believe they have a book in them and only one book and they just want to get it out?
I guess I'm not as optimistic on that front as I used to be. And, God bless the publishers. Most of them are in New York, but they are the gatekeepers. And I think I heard some statistics saying, it's in the 90s of rejection percentages, right? Mm-hmm. But that also goes to the agents. So the agents, are actually in some ways, they reject 95% or whatever of people, submitting to them. So in a way, the agents are like the unpaid employees of the publishing houses that are weeding out, But do they really know? Great writing from something that will sell, or something that's a flashpoint, or lightning in a bottle of a cultural moment? I don't know.
Yeah, some specialized. Some are definitely literary agents, and others are looking for the next Goldfinch. Well, actually, that was a very literary book, so that's not a good example. But looking for the next maybe Cold Mountain or something like that.
Yeah, but I think it's a lot more. I think it's more. Unfortunately, we live in such a polarized age, and the New York publishing houses couldn't help but be affected by that. So there's also
something about your language, Chip. You always fall back into geopolitics and hardball. You're so political, and I don't mean that in a bad sense. For our listeners, Chip is a news junkie, of course. He says former journalist, but I think he's still a journalist in a lot of ways. And, there's just the language, you'll notice it's don't be surprised if you hear perestroika along the way, or telemetry, or start talks or something along those lines. I'm only partly joking because your language, one of the things that I see about your language when you're writing, Chip, you use very muscular language. So many of the references you make are writ large. I mean, you use very powerful language, and which is, I think, so lacking from most novels. There's just not enough novels out there that really try to light the sky up a little bit. And obviously, there's a danger in that too, because we're always going to be prone to get melodramatic, overdo it a bit. But if anything, I think there's a real shortage of truly, explosive type writing out there.
Thank you. And I will just say, and no, I'm not getting paid for saying this, but your first book, Hardwood, was fantastic. And having read quite a bit.
You said that in past tense.
No, it is just a terrifically rendered, beautiful piece of writing, and it's a Random House book by any measure. And I think I've seen other writers and other friends of mine that are so talented like you, and they can have trouble getting a massive publisher to back them. Sometimes they're working other jobs. They have, their agents aren't on the case the way they should be. For me, I've been very hit and miss with agents. And after my first agent got sick and then passed away, I think it was almost like a form of insecurity that I didn't try to shoot for another one of his stature. And unfortunately, you do need, somebody representing you that, has contacts and believes in you and sees, can correct you and give you, be mentory, play that role. So there's so many variables, but your book was outstanding.
Oh, I appreciate the kind words.
No, I mean, I loved it from the very beginning, I'm not giving up on saying that on some major publishers list, but it is, if you read like the New York Times bestseller list, right, and you read 10 of the books that are buzzy, that, they're getting all the publicity, they're going to be in the front of the line for awards, movie adaptations or series, getting the star reviews. I'll bet, I will bet you if you took a reasonable sample of the population, there would only be 2 of those books that people crossing over would all endorse. And I constantly read books that people are telling me I have to love and practically, marry in a literary way, and I'm just not feeling it. I don't get it. But I can see the conceit of the idea. The author is talented, but nonetheless, it's not, To Kill a Mockingbird. It's not, it's not Tom Sawyer.
Very few of those, yeah, that's for sure. Let me ask you, I know you're a guy who's got a lot, I think I know this about you, Chip, that you've got your next 3, 4, maybe even 5 pieces of work already in mind. I work kind of that way. I've always got these ideas sitting on the back burner, but this is what I'm working on right now. And what my mind will make me start thinking about a future project. And, really to cut to the question is, because I was about to ask you a compound question, I'm going to try to keep it a little straighter than that, keep it singular. Have you ever abandoned a novel partway through?
No, I haven't written enough. I'm still trying to find my way and my style, and I have not done that.
So you really finish what you start. I mean, you haven't gotten partway through and then said, like, I can tell you that the first 2 I wrote myself into a corner and had to abandon them, but you found a way. So you were more committed to your concept than I was, I guess.
Yes, but I also didn't go, with a big-time agent trying to query all the major publishing houses and getting rejected and depressed. I mean, there's a really good author named Jonathan Evison who has a new book out, and he'll tell stories. I think like his first handful of novels all got turned down, but he kept at it, and probably
a million stories like that. Absolutely.
There's a million stories like that. There are. So I'm about to start my second novel. It's going to be tied in with Arroyo lightly. It's kind of a loosely confederated or aligned trilogy.
Well, tell us about Arroyo first. Go ahead and tell us, our listeners, about Arroyo. Kind of put it in a nutshell and what inspired it.
Okay, so I live in Pasadena, California, suburb of Los Angeles. I grew up in this town, and for as long as I can remember, people have been talking and debating, some degree admiring, this famous bridge that gulfs the 2 sides of Pasadena, and really where Pasadena connects to Los Angeles. It's called the Colorado Street Bridge. However, when I was a kid, and almost everybody in town doesn't call it that. That's like the given name its mother gave it, the Colorado Street Bridge. It was known as Suicide Bridge because a huge number of people, like we're talking about over 150, have jumped to their death from this bridge. And it's also a bridge, and most big bridges do attract hopeless, depressed people. But this bridge is unusual because it's very old, built in 1913. It's got a curving design, which you almost never see with a bridge. It's got this Beaux Arts kind of Greek architectural style that will mesmerize you. And it mesmerized me. And just thinking of the grandeur and the daring do to create this very high bridge, 150 feet off the ground in some places, going over a treacherous gorge. And the idea that man could brick that gap was really interesting to me. And, because people didn't know the story of the bridge, but they just kept talking about the bridge, it got me thinking, this could be a good backdrop for a story. I started researching more about the bridge for a freelance piece I did when I was working on another book, because I was still writing journalism, and it got a big reaction, this story, and it was about a construction accident that unfortunately befell the bridge while it was being built in 1913. A bunch of folks died, and yet nobody talked about the victims. All the hullabaloo and the concern was, can we get our bridge back finished by Christmas time? This is a bridge that was built right in the beginning of the feverish automobile age. So it was really important for the city's pride and its, ability to bring people in and out. And when I started looking into the characters of 1913 Pasadena, I just started going down that rabbit hole and getting more fascinated. I mean, around this time we had Teddy Roosevelt, we had Upton Sinclair, who was long a hero of mine. We had Adolphus and Lillian Bush, two of the later-day founders of the Budweiser Corporation. You had all types of interesting millionaires and characters and dreamers in this time. And so, it was tailor-made for a novel, a historical novel. And so I created a dreamer of a guy building solar light lamps at the beginning of the electrical age as well. He was kind of a stand-in for me. My main character, Nick Chance, because I think dogs are magical. I decided to have a clairvoyant canine be his best friend, as well as sort of his guardian angel. And I made the bridge and the city of Pasadena characters. And this is my first time writing fiction. I had never written so much as a short story. And it took me 7 or 8 drafts to get this right, Mike. And I will tell you, I'd probably go back over that novel again and take a few things out, simplify it. Like a lot of first-time authors, I try to pack all my frenetic ideas between 2 covers. Mm-hmm. And sometimes it gets confusing. Some people like it, other people get lost, and you never want your readers to get lost. So I have my characters mainly existing in 1913 Pasadena. Something happens, and then they all come back alive, or most of the characters come back alive in 1993 Pasadena. So you get the compare and contrast. You get the question about, I believe in reincarnation, multiple lives. I think death, there is no death. It's just a transition. So it became a platform for me to share my spiritual views after losing a number of family members and do a lot of obsessive reading and research on this subject. And so I could fill in all my heart's desires, but just in the course of writing a drama. And, I had to deal with things I never did as a journalist. I had to write about sex, graphic death, historical points of view, histories of the city told by make-believe people. There was a lot to deal with. And, a lot people have asked me about my book, and somebody at the local bookstore gave a better description than me. They said, this is really a shadow history of Pasadena, kind of the unvarnished, unwhitewashed story that the city fathers don't advertise in brochures. And that's exactly what I wanted to go for. And so, it is a story. Hopefully it makes people laugh. There's some absurd actions and scenes. There's excitement. There's death. There's, mysteries. And, I try to follow the most basic advice. I try to write a story that I would want to read. Yeah, exactly. So, let me ask you this before we get to the novel that you're working on. I'm wondering how much copy you produce versus how much makes the final process. So if you were to take 1,000 words, yes, would you be writing 1,000 words? Would you be writing 2, 3, 5, 10,000 words? What would the ratio be? Do you have any clue about that? Okay, that's an incisive question. Let's say there's 1,000 words that I wrote on day one, and now through multiple drafts, right? Like half a dozen drafts, I would say of those 1,000 words, 75 words might make the final cut.
Yeah, there you go. Yeah.
I mean, this is really, Bill Clinton once said, the key to success is, it's 90% perspiration and 10% inspiration. That's very true with rewriting. You have to, killing your darlings is often very easy. Blowing up your plot is hard. Hearing that something that you're in love with doesn't work, and you need to drop it for the bigger sense of the story.
For the greater good. For the greater good of all concerned. Yeah, absolutely. And, that's one of the things that I remember a writing coach who told me years ago that he said when you're writing, he was saying writing, but he was working on a novel, and he said you have to be willing to throw out very large amounts of work. You have to be willing to do a day's work and just basically maybe trash the whole thing.
Yes.
It's that do. Kind of, you have to be that exacting with the written word and with the plot or the narrative or what have you. So
it's true.
It's grueling.
Yeah. I had a journalism professor at USC that said you should go through any story of any type, whether it's a book or a feature article, and you should be able to eliminate 2/3 of any cutesy writing or, sentences that you really loved, and the story still hangs together very well. And that is true. This is a guy named A.G. Langeth, who was a best-selling author and New York Times reporter himself. I also had, at the LA Business Journal, where you and I first met, we had a Times editor named Bob Baker come to the paper and give us writing advice.
Yeah, I was the one who brought him in, Chip. I was the guy who brought him in, yeah.
Okay, well, and he sadly, he has passed on. I'm sure he's writing his next book, his next plane of existence. But he said, when you go back and you edit your story, you have to take on the characteristics of this grumpy, cantankerous, possessive guy that will only let in, certain ideas and sentences and prose if it passes your very stern, high, appraisal. You don't just junk up something because you got you had a brilliant, spontaneous idea. You have to be very discriminating. And have those gates more likely closed than open, because it's very easy to come back and you saw something on TV, you read a book, and I want to work in this little idea or wrinkle. You just, you have to just be extremely scrupulous about what makes the final cut, because nobody is going to cry that you cut out a colorful character if they're already entranced by what you're writing.
Yeah, and George Saunders, I just recently heard him say this, the great short story writer, 10th of December, and then wrote the novel Lincoln in the Bardo, which was, I think...
I can't wait to read that.
I don't know if that won the Pulitzer or got shortlisted. It was one or the other. But at any rate, he tells the students, take your piece of writing, now cut it by 20%. And then he says, take a look at it there, then cut it by 10% more. And then he talks to them about, and I might have the percentages a little bit off, but he talks about them revisiting that piece and taking another 10%. And he says, keep doing that until you know that you're hitting bone or you're seeing blood. Because basically what he's saying is we tend to write a sentence, we're saying something, and then we repeat it in the next sentence. This is an example of the lack of editing that goes, our self-editing. We write something and then we reinforce it as if the reader didn't understand it. So we've come back and basically said the same thing in different words. We didn't want to cut anything out. We thought we were being clever in both cases. Or as he says, the next couple sentences oftentimes are a fancy dance, and you can just get rid of those, and then it just drives the story forward. So that's the kind of rigor that you're talking about. It's that kind of rigor.
That's true. And one thing we don't, as former journalists, we have a lot to learn. I still have 20 lifetimes to learn. I think in my 20th life from now, I finally get to the point where I'm thinking, I know what I'm doing. Nobody ever taught us to write dialogue, and dialogue is a gigantic piece of fiction. And if you find yourself there's too much background or description or digression, side stories, and you don't have dialogue moving your characters forward, you're effing up. and you better go back. Dialogue will save you because that's where characters really reveal themselves. And that's what a novel's about, is characters.
So give us your philosophy on narrative, on dialogue. Which, I mean, you've already revealed a little bit of it, but I'm curious, what's your philosophy if you were telling young writers, here's how you should be approaching dialogue, or just explaining your way of doing it? What would you say?
I think, again, it's you get your first draft down on paper. Hopefully it's not going to be, where you have to,
but I'm talking specifically about dialogue.
No. I'm going to hit that. Okay. I think you need to write your first draft, print it out, and then just kind of thumb through it. And if you're not seeing a lot of dialogue in there, there's something wrong with your story. In terms of dialogue, rewriting it gets you to know your characters better. Like, so for the novel I'm working on, I've already developed character sketches and a 12-page outline. But I'm not wed to it. But by rewriting, eventually, Mike, you know your story, you know your characters so well that when it comes time for them to say something, you're looking out of the world through their eyes, right? So, like, in my upcoming book, it's really almost a buddy story. And it needs to be, when I'm switching from my buddy to my character, I need to be able to see, not my buddy, to be able to see me the way I'm really presented in the novel. I need to use language that only that person would use. I need to sound like a full human being and not just some writer's idea of a character. So, you have to speak looking out from their eyes. And something somebody told me I really found with Arroyo on the 7th or 8th draft, eventually your characters do tell you what to do. They'll tell you, okay, how am I going to react in this scene when confronted with Heavy? How am I going to handle, a girlfriend, telling me a lie? It's just purely knowing your characters, and I know all the great writers, have mastered that. So they're, in a way, they're so developed and they're so good at their craft. It's not as difficult because their characters are kind of telling their fingers what keys to press.
So tell us about the novel you're working on now, your second one.
So it's this is there will be some characters from Arroyo in here because I did find in Pasadena there's people want to learn more about the area. They're interested in what's true and what's not. A lot of history has been forgotten.
So this is still going to be. So is this a sequel to Arroyo?
It's a very loosely affiliated one, and so I won't tell you my two titles because they're still in gestation. But it's really about a true story that I'm turning into a novel, where I went to a very difficult prep school in a suburb next to Pasadena called La Cañada, Flint Ridge. The prep school was Flint Ridge Preparatory School for Boys. It went co-ed my senior year, which was a cultural explosion that provides great fiction material. But my friend Tom Tookie left Flint Ridge before graduation for reasons I later would find out. And he saw a story about me, about one of my books. And we had lunch and we reconnected after like 30 years, right, of not being in contact at all. And he was the most brilliant kid in a class full of extremely smart kids, many of them from extremely accomplished families. And some of them, many of my classmates were sons of quote unquote great men. You can be a great man, someone who's won a Nobel Prize or, earned a gigantic fortune, and then versus, a quote good man, who is just a salt of the earth person who may also be accomplished. But anyway, we had lunch, we got along like two peas in a pod, and then shortly afterwards, by maybe 6 months, Tom called me and said, I'm dying of multiple myeloma, which was one of the conditions Colin Powell had. I need you to help me write an apology letter. And, The apology letter went back to our near high school days when he fired a bullet through the front window of the most bullied kids, the family of the most bullied kids in our school's house, re-traumatizing them, creating hell for him, and it really haunted him his whole life. This one bullet he fired in the middle of the night when he was highly impaired. He was trying to shoot at a wild coyote. It turned out not to be a wild coyote. And so I'm creating a story between two people that reconnect after a long time, as a genius faces his deathbed, and showing, like all kids, we have a lot of unresolved business from our childhood to reconcile. We're not always as together as we seem. The idea about the power that somebody who knows they're owed an apology has over the prospective forgiver or forgivee, those types of things, and I made my friend Tom a promise that I would write his story the best I can and capture his spirit. And I cannot describe what an interesting combination of person he was. As a kid with an IQ that was a little bit like the movie. Did you see the movie Good Will Hunting?
Yes.
Okay, my friend Tom was like at that IQ level, but he was also a wild child that made me, when I was a wild child, look like I was the tooth fairy. The things that he pulled off, and it was largely a cry for attention from his parents and others, that he was in crisis and he needed help. The school I went to was terrific academically, but in terms of the culture and after the bell rang, it was Lord of the Flies, Mike. And that is actually, I've gone back and read 20 books to prepare for this, and Lord of the Flies still stands out as the best like ecosystem model for a prep school that I've ever read. And that includes old school, Skippy Dies, A Separate Piece, classics, right? And so this book is also about what happens as adults when we've been a bully or we've been bullied. And
how many characters are you going to have in that book? I'm curious, because it sounds like a story that could be told very sparely with very few characters, or
yes.
Sprawl.
That's an excellent question. It's really got primarily 3 characters, but there is going to be a retinue of side characters, and I have to be careful because, I am writing about people I know, good friends of mine. I don't want to blow my relationship with them. So I'm happy to, fuzz some things out, change names, appearances, things like that. But there's enough meat here to tell a compelling story. And, you read, we hear today about the toxic masculinity, right? Well, one of the nuclear power centers producing toxic masculinity are prep schools. Of course, we didn't know that in 1980. We just thought these were just alpha dogs on campus. But the bullying element can haunt somebody their whole life. And I say this as somebody who was bullied themselves and also was probably indifferent to others being bullied when I should have stepped in. So, just think about going back to your high school reunion 20 years later. So my book will start off in 1980, and then it will reconvene in 2000, as my class had this 20-year anniversary. And we'll see the changes in society, how people turned out. But it's mainly going to be about, my friend Tom and this terrible night that changed his whole life. This is a kid that could have gone to Stanford and crushed it in early computer programming. But because of this bullet and other issues in his life, he never made it to the top of his potential, right? And it drove a lot of the things in his life.
How far along are you right now? How far along are you with the manuscript?
I have done all my research, have my outline done, and I'm about to start page 1. So I'm 0% done. But in this one, I'm learning lessons for my first novel, and I intend to have a first draft done after like 5 months.
Oh, good for you. That sounds really interesting. It sounds like there's all kinds of possibilities with it. And now you've got friends to protect. And you made me think of Phillip Roth, who famously was quoted as saying, when a writer is born into a family, that's the end of that family.
and William Faulkner, and it's funny because Phillip Roth is one of my favorite writers. He's so diverse. His book, A Portnoy's Complaint, is going to figure into my book because I'm going to be a writer in my story, and I'm going to get a love of writing by reading Portnoy's Complaint, which is about a child.
Yes. I know it very well.
Smothered by an overprotective mom, and it turns into a sex addict. Well, let me tell you, at an all-boys school, any book with sexual content made the rounds, and I think I got a C in geometry just because I kept reading the sexual passages in Jaws. When I should have been paying attention to an isosceles triangle, I was reading the part about Hooper and the sheriff's wife.
Yeah,
and I wasn't alone. But, it's a prep school. Really, for me, it filled my head with possibilities. And it gave me a giant leg up going to, college. But prep schools, especially back then, it didn't teach you a lot about compassion and empathy. And those are things I had to learn later in life, so I think the prep school literary canon, this will be different because I'm going to show what they look like later, and I'm going to try to drill down on what is it about these schools that puts so much pressure on young people. And we had a high number of kids at the school that, were addicts, got into car accidents, premature death. Some of them felt the grave weight of very, very famous parents, and it's not always easy being in that shadow. My dad was a child of the Depression. My relationship with my dad is going to play a big part. And he didn't want me to be a writer. He didn't understand Led Zeppelin and, war wagons on Halloween night and, getting into neighborhood trouble because, he succeeded in a way so I could do all those things. But we could have been from different planets. And he was like a mathematical genius. And when it came time for him to try to help me on some of my math homework, I would get flop sweats. I would get the yips. And it gave me kind of a lifelong fear of numbers because I could not ever be anywhere as good at math as he could. He could beat me using a slide rule with a trigonometry equation versus me using a Texas Instrument calculator. That's how good he was. But I was not the only one there. So, part of the story, Mike, is discovering who I am. And you don't really know who you are in high school. And it took me a lot of years to learn. All these years, I was a creative writer just living in a reporter's shell. This is what I was born to do, tapping into my mom's creative side of the family. So there's a lot here, but in the bottom line, it's about somebody like me, a writer, who will obviously have a lot more troubles than my friend knows, trying to help him craft an apology letter to a persecuted kid who also never got over what happened to him in high school.
So are you going to be a geographic place writer? I mean, Carl Hyacin is completely associated with Florida, Jim Harrison with Montana, Jimmy Breslin and Pete Hamill with New York City. And Pasadena, where I used to live there myself, as you know.
Yes.
It's such an interesting town. It's got such a... I could actually see Pasadena being the venue for a whole series of novels. Certainly the LA Basin for sure, but that's been done. I don't think anybody's been as geographically specific as you might be starting out with now in Pasadena.
Well, there are a clutch of books about Pasadena.
By novelists?
By a novelist. There is actually a book called Pasadena by David Evershoff, who was most famous for the book that inspired the movie The Danish Girl. He's a really good writer. In fact, he went to a rival high school of mine. He's a major editor back in a major New York publishing house and a really good writer. But he wrote a historical kind of novel about Pasadena. But what's ironic about it is most of the novel takes place like in San Diego. there was a more recent book called Helen of Pasadena, which was your classic chick lit, written by somebody, I vaguely know. And it scratched a literary itch and became a very big bestseller. And it made me think, there's more meat on this Pasadena bone. To answer your question, yeah, for my next 2 novels, it's going to be Pasadena-centric. Although in this next novel, I'm branching out into La Cañada Flint Ridge because it's got a really sensational and scandalous history that goes well with the general tone of my story. Somebody like my character that's, a budding reporter is like going, oh my God, I never knew there was a murder involved in creating this community, or, there was a stock swindle or whatever, rocks your boat. So I'm going to expand out. I'm going to expand out a little bit, but, I've picked out some other locales of Pasadena. Arroyo focused, on the bridge, on the Arroyo Seco, a few landmarks, but I picked out a few other places in Pasadena that I think are fun to write about.
Sure. Yeah. So, and just so the listeners know, because you don't know the geography of Southern California necessarily, La Cañada Flint Ridge is right next door to Pasadena. In fact, JPL is the Jet Propulsion Laboratory, but they say Pasadena because it's a city people recognize and probably where the media is staying in the hotels when they go to visit. So
that's right. They don't want to. And they say it's La Canada. They don't see the little accent over the word. But yeah, I mean. La Cañada Flint Ridge is a small kind of one street town. It's just
very pastoral. Very pastoral. We go to you take me to a restaurant there, Chip. We've gone there a couple times. I forget the name of it.
Yeah,
terrific.
The Dish.
The Dish. There you go.
But I mean, it's getting there's Starbucks and some corporate retailers, but it was a community created just to cater to the rich, and it was by a man named Frank Flint. And as a Flint Ridge, and he partly created this to be the can't miss bride of Pasadena. Pasadena would so love this La Cañada Flint Ridge community that it would annex it, and lo and behold, Pasadena jilted this lover and said, "No, I don't think you're going to be part of us." And so there's some of that is in our story, and much of this area was created by ambitious men that saw fortunes dripping off the trees, and it doesn't work that way.
Right.
It doesn't work that way. So, I do have as sarcastic sense of humor. I'm going to work that in here, but the tone of the story won't be kind of as lighthearted as Arroyo.
Well, let me ask you, when you're geocentric like that, and you're going to be writing from a particular city, I can see a couple of advantages to that. One is that you know it very well. You've got emotional connection to it as well. Then the other aspect of it, which plays into the emotion as well, is just the romance of immersing yourself in a place that you've spent your entire life. Is it one or the other, or both of those, Chip, that you feel like, or in maybe some other things you point out that you think are advantages to being geographically specific like that?
No, it's both. It's both of those. It's both knowledge and resonance, because I do know a lot about the area from growing up around here and doing a lot of reading over the last few months getting ready, and
you love the place. You're wed to the place. Let's face it. Vroman's Bookstore is one of the greatest bookstores in America, and it's still in operation there in Pasadena and has been since. You did book signing there, didn't you, Chip, with Arroyo?
Oh, yeah. I've done many signings at Vroman's. I love Vroman's. They've been so great to me. But, for example, people haven't written about back in the day, there was a park near us at Flint Ridge called Oak Grove Park. Okay. So in 1980, what do you think people called it? Because there's other high schools around Flint Ridge Prep, and now bringing those in lightly. But we used to call it Smoke Grove Park, because that's where everybody would go to smoke cigarettes, smoke weed. There was a Frisbee golf course. Today it's called the Hahomunga Watershed, because we are getting back to recognizing, Native Americans that established this area. We stole their land. Other people stole land. But it's, nobody talks about those areas. I know there's a lot of people around the world even that still remember the days of Hahomunga as Smoke Grove Park. I came so close to getting arrested my last day at Flint Ridge after I finished my last final at Oak Grove Park. And it was, it took a girl doing a Oscar-worthy crying performance, begging not to get handcuffed, that kept me out of the slammer. I have to use that. That's part of my whole self-myth. So, there's lots of that around here. And, there's also ways to talk about how the city's official history falls away when you get real fact. Yeah. And I like that part because I think so much of history is BS.
I also left out Lear McMurtry and his Texas novels, just to extend that out a little bit. So, listen, my friend, we're running a little low on time here, so let me ask you a couple rapid-fire questions, one of which is let me start with who the most influential writers have been, writers of fiction for you.
Okay, these are. I will say that you do more homework and ask better questions, Mike, than the average bear. So good for you for this. I've been thinking about it. I would say my three favorite fiction writers are T.C. Boyle, John Irving, and Phillip Roth.
And tell me about each one of those in just a sentence or two. What distinguishes them, or what makes them live so large in your imagination? T.C.
Boyle is just a magnificent talent, and he without being ham-handed, he's hilarious because he finds the contradictions in people and then makes them wear that on their sleeve. Phillip Roth is just a killer in terms of getting to the heart of stories and not pulling any punches. In reading Portnoy's Complaint, that's the case. In reading Everyman, he's not afraid. I mean, I find myself very depressed after finishing a Phillip Roth book, but
Why is that? You mean because he deals with dark, heavy issues, or because it comes to an end and you wish it was continuing?
It's the former. I believe he was an atheist. I'm not an atheist.
Oh yeah, he was a sworn atheist for sure. Yeah.
And which is funny because now he's in heaven and he's going, maybe I have to revise that line. But I loved American Pastoral, and it was a long book, but it was so beautifully told. It was a book he's so good at. There's a narrator at the very beginning of the book, and then that person disappears, which violates almost all the writing principle. But he just cuts to the bone and moves the narrative along. And when he wants to write a beautiful sentence, he can. But there's something about his writing that gets you all consumed with the story.
I agree. And he shows off without showing off. I mean, he's not even trying to show off. He doesn't get flashy, but the quality of his thoughts are so good.
They are, and you can see his writing evolved. I mean, Portnoy's Complaint is a little hyperventilating at times, and stream of consciousness.
Well, that was his first novel, right? I mean, he was a kid when he wrote that, and
he was like
that
27,
just exploded on the scene.
Yeah. American Pastoral won the Pulitzer, and it should have, and it really foreshadows the woke generation. I really love that book. And then John Irving, John Irving is not, I don't know if he's as gifted a writer as Phillip Roth, but he's just as good a storyteller. And I loved A Prayer for Owen Meany, of course, World According to Garp, and then his last book, An Avenue of Mysteries, is so well done. He writes with heart. He writes also with social relevance without banging you over the head about, homophobia or AIDS epidemic, etc. But he just creates characters where you can just see them in your head so clearly, and their thoughts and motivations. He doesn't write with a lot of description about background. He doesn't immerse you in history of places. He just tells dramas that suck you in. And with Arroyo, I mean, there's some magical realism, and I was wrestling. How do I talk about magical realism? How much do I have to explain the origin of it? And when I read Avenue of Mysteries, there's some magical realism, and that he just deals with it smoothly. He doesn't get preoccupied. It's not a crutch. It's not a Deus ex machina. It's just part of the fabric of the universe he's created, and that really helped me. I think he helped free me to tell the story in my heart more than any other writer.
And he writes about children a lot, which a lot of male novelists don't include a heck of a lot of children, but like, for instance, Hotel New Hampshire had a lot of children. Obviously, The World According to Garp it was a couple with 2 children, and he's just
Peripheral when Beanie had a dwarf. He's just. I don't think people understand how great that guy is, and I'm forever grateful to John Irving. And so those are those are the
big three. Those are the three that you would invite. Those are the three who you would invite to a dinner party at your place. If you can invite 3 authors, 3 fiction writers to dine with you and with your wife Kate, they would be those guys right there. That's a tremendous lineup. I'll tell you that. Let me. I will. Yeah. You are going to invite them? You invite me too, because if you're going to bring Phillip Roth back from the dead, I want to see what kind of condition he's in. But like I said, it's living or dead. But invite me too if you can play Lazarus there, because that would be fascinating.
I know that actually could be the good premise for a book. A young writer with his writer's block. Is so desperate that he gets the Ouija board out and he summons a former atheist writer. I have to give him advice.
You're giving away some good plot lines here. So let's finish up with my asking you to let the aspiring novelists out there know what you would recommend to them. What's your piece of advice to them? They're just getting started in the game. What would your best piece of advice be?
Be dedicated to your idea. Write a first draft. Make yourself write on a regular schedule, even if it's only half an hour a day or 4 hours a day. Make yourself write every day. Be committed to producing a first draft within a reasonable amount of time. And just knowing that by doing that, you're already ahead of the game. And then once you have that draft done, put it away in a drawer, do something else for a few weeks, come back at it, and you will have a brand new perspective. If there's one book on writing I would recommend to young writers, it's Stephen King's memoir on writing, where it's both a memoir and a writing guide, and he gives excellent advice. Excellent advice.
He does.
I mean, it's indispensable. I actually have 20 of his writing tips up on my wall, and then his first piece of advice is write for yourself and then worry about the audience. Also, he's not big on passive voice. But, be dedicated to a first draft. Know it's going to be terrible, but also know from from terrible to magnificent follows a logical pattern. And it's just about rewriting. I would say once you have a draft that you're reasonably happy with, select 3 people that you know and trust and give it to them and ask for their feedback. And if every person comes back with a different criticism or reaction, put that in perspective. If they all come back and they say, I don't understand this character, I thought it was too plotting here, you might want to rethink a premise, then you have a problem that you need to address. But it's just a problem.
What about the contradictory advice also, Chip? I want you to address that, because this happens with writers who approach agents as well. One will say, you need more dialogue. The other one will say, you need to change the ending. Or actually, yes. They'll say, you need less dialogue. One will say more, one will say less. So you hand it out to your 3 trusted readers. You get contradictory advice on it. Well, how do you deal with that?
There's always a tiebreaker. I mean, you can give it, if you have an agent, that would be the person to give it to, and you can summarize, hey, this is what the one person said, there was not enough dialogue, another person said there was too much. What do you think? You can tie break in that way. But I just caution against putting too much value in other people's opinion, because fiction especially is so subjective. I mean, I've had people on Amazon say they give me a 1 star. I don't understand this book. When there's reincarnation, I'm out. There's a dog that can, use telepathy. That's so far-fetched. Another gives me 5 stars. This is one of the best books I've ever written. I'm buying 5 copies to give to my friends. You just can't put that much weight in it, and it's like diluting a pure substance. So, I think you write the book you want to read, put a lot of thought and effort into it, and if it comes back with just deeply contradictory advice, ask your agent or ask somebody else what they think. But, I mean, I would not go and rewrite it based on somebody else's whims.
Yeah, because you could end up having to – there are literally young writers out there who will rewrite a novel based on one agent's take. Then the agent doesn't actually accept it. And then they go to another agent and they're being told to rewrite it again. You could spend your whole life doing that. I agree completely that you need to write what you want to write. Whatever style it is, whatever you care about, whatever fires you up, because it's the only way it's going to be sustainable. Writing is not going to be sustainable if you're doing stuff that you don't really want to do, but you're doing it to try to make it cinematic. You're trying to perhaps appeal to a certain audience.
But that's already prostituting your idea for the sake of somebody else's acceptance, or reward.
And that rarely works. That will rarely work.
No, to thine own self be true, and that's same with the story. I was just looking at some old rejection letters, which every author gets for my Smog book, or for the book about my uncle, which I've now recently just optioned to turn into a series. Some of them said, I don't like this story. It feels like just anecdotes strung together. I'm not that enamored with his prose. Others said, I love his writing. This is a great character. And then they turn it down. So, I mean, it's just all over the map. I mean, you also have to think about who is the one judging your story. And for a lot of publishing houses, it's like somebody who's been out of college 7 or 8 years. They were an English major at Vassar or, Cornell or Iowa or wherever they went to school. They don't have a lot of life experience, and maybe they're coming at it with, views that were greatly influenced by their writing professors.
And that's a good point. A frame of reference is critical. I mean, that's one of the nice...
Totally.
I mean, if you're dealing, like you say, Chip, with somebody who's still wet behind the ears, it's not... they may not even have a frame of reference that is required to really understand your work.
Yes, and if you were going to give like they call them beta readers, that's where you give your a prepared draft to have somebody critique it. It almost would be good if you gave it to a established writer, a friend of yours who's a bibliophile, bookophile, you know what I mean? And then maybe one other person, that you respect that's in a different line of work than writing, and just see what they say. So, I mean, you don't want to get groupthink. On the other hand, you don't want to just give it to people that you shouldn't be asking for an opinion because they read, very little. They watch a lot of TV. So I haven't done that with any of my books. Not one single book have I ever given a draft for somebody to read. But I think I'm trying to do different things, trying to learn. So I think for this next book, and I think I'll be asking you to read my draft as well.
I'm looking forward to it, Chip. Then
I can reject everything you say.
Exactly.
Right.
Just be true to your own instincts. I think that's a big part of it is instincts.
But I'll just say this last thing. I think it also applies to athletics, mathematics, other things. I think the key in life is finding that it quality about yourself, where you have that it that somebody else doesn't. Just like you don't have their it quality, though you might wish you do. I think either you can write or you can't. It's just how your brain is wired. Mike, you're somebody that can write, and if you had started off as a fiction writer instead of being in journalism, who knows where you'd be. But you still, regardless, you had that it quality. And sometimes it's very hard to hear, you don't have that it. As a kid, I wanted to be a wide receiver in the NFL until I learned I had good hands and terrible foot speed, and I couldn't take a hit. You know,
well, yeah, I wanted to play in the NBA. I was going to be an NBA point guard, or I was going to be one of the great scoring machines in the NBA.
I still remember your three-point shot.
I always had a good three-point shot, but that's the least of it. So yeah, it's
but your it quality is writing, and so you know, just somebody that's writing, you know, you can a decent writer can become a good writer, but I don't know if a decent writer can become an elite writer just based on my experience. Maybe I'm wrong. Hard work will carry you a long, long ways, but I think you have to have an innate talent. You know, in writing, you just look at the world a different way. And I'll tell you, after Arroyo, I started activating parts of my brain I didn't even know were, you know, working. And all of a sudden, I just had this gusher of ideas, you know, and I couldn't stop. And sometimes I wish I could just shut that part of my brain off, you know, and just focus on my novel on hand. But anyway.
So we're going to have to shut the recorder off because this is starting to get to be like a kind of a Joe Rogan podcast. We're out past an hour. If we went on for another hour and a half, we'd be at Joe Rogan length. So we don't want to do that. Nope. But Chip, hey, it's always good rapping with you. And, you know, I'm excited for what Arroyo did out in the market. I'm excited for your new one. And thanks for coming on the program. And don't be a stranger. We'll certainly have you back down the road.
Thank you, Mike. Great chatting with you. And if nothing else, if I'm on the run because people are angry at my next novel, you know where to find me up in Central Oregon.
I do. And that will remain a secret.
All right, man. God bless.
Take care,
Keep
pal.
writing.